This is the document they tried to bury before it hit the newswire. As of 9 a.m. this morning, Friday, February 28, 2026, the Office of the Prime Minister of Canada has just published an 11-page economic strategy brief titled Canada Beyond America, a Roadmap for Sovereign Prosperity. It is addressed not to Ottawa. It is not addressed to Parliament. It is addressed symbolically and strategically directly to the international community. And for the first time in the history of the North American Economic Alliance, a sitting Prime Minister of Canada has formally declared that the decades-long process of deeper economic integration with the United States is permanently over, not paused, not under review, over. Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, the former governor of the Bank of Canada, the man who steered global central banking through the 2008 financial crisis, has just dropped a precision-guided economic missile on the White House lawn. And Donald Trump's team has no answer. This is not a press release. This is not a talking point from a Sunday show. This is an 11-page operational blueprint, dense with trade projections, supply chain redirections, defense procurement overhauls, and bilateral deal frameworks with India, Australia, Japan, the European Union, and yes, China. We are talking about $280 billion in redirected Canadian spending over 5 years. We are talking about the termination of 70% of Canadian defense procurement from American manufacturers. We are talking about a formal pivot of Canadian critical mineral exports, the lithium, the cobalt, the nickel that American tech companies desperately need, away from the United States and toward a coalition of middle powers that Carney has been quietly assembling since his Davos speech 5 weeks ago. Sources inside the West Wing describe the mood as blindsided. The National Economic Council reportedly had no advance copy. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was informed by a Bloomberg terminal alert, not a diplomatic cable. In this special report, we are going to break down exactly what is in this document. We are going to explain the financial mechanisms that make this devastating for American industry. We are going to show you why the Supreme Court's IEEPA ruling 8 days ago made this inevitable. And we are going to answer the question that no one in Washington wants to ask out loud. Has America just lost its most important economic ally? Buckle up. The maps are being redrawn in real time. To understand why Carney pulled the trigger today, you have to understand the financial earthquake that hit Washington 8 days ago. On February 20th, 2026, the United States Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in Learning Resources, Inc. versus Trump that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act does not authorize the president to impose tariffs. Chief Justice Roberts, joined by Gorsuch, Barrett, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson, struck down the entire architecture of Trump's tariff regime, the Liberation Day tariffs, the fentanyl tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China, all of it gone. The Tax Foundation estimates that over $160 billion in illegally collected tariff revenue must now potentially be refunded to importers. The IEEPA tariffs were projected to generate $1.4 trillion over the next decade. That revenue stream has been severed. Within hours, Trump scrambled. He invoked Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, slapping a 10% global tariff that he immediately tried to raise to 15%. But here's the catch. Section 122 tariffs expire in 150 days. They cap at 15%, and they require congressional extension to continue. The emperor's tariff sword has been replaced with a butter knife. Carney saw the opening. According to sources close to the Prime Minister's office, the 11-page document had been in preparation since mid-January, right after the Davos speech where Carney told the world that the rules-based international order had experienced a rupture, not a transition. But the Supreme Court ruling accelerated the timeline. The original release date was reportedly March 15th. They moved it up by 2 weeks. The Section 122 tariffs have a 150-day clock. That clock started on February 24th. It expires on July 24th. Carney's team calculated that the window between now and July is the moment of maximum American vulnerability. The White House cannot impose new comprehensive tariffs without congressional approval. Congress just voted 219 to 211, with Republicans crossing the aisle to rebuke Trump's tariff policy on Canada. The political will for new tariffs does not exist, and Carney knows it. The House resolution, while largely symbolic, sent a message that even Trump's own party recognizes the trade war has become economically suicidal. Speaker Johnson tried to prevent the vote and failed. The procedural gambit collapsed on the floor. The coalition for tariff aggression is hemorrhaging support. Let us get into the specifics of the document. Section 1 is titled Trade Corridor Diversification and outlines the creation of a $5 billion trade diversification corridor fund to physically redirect Canadian exports away from American ports and toward Pacific and Atlantic trade routes. We are talking about new port capacity in Prince Rupert, British Columbia. We are talking about expanded rail infrastructure connecting Alberta's energy sector directly to Asian-bound shipping lanes. We are talking about a new LNG terminal in Newfoundland designed specifically to service European buyers. Canada currently sends roughly 70% of its exports to the United States, worth approximately $490 billion annually. Carney's target, reduce that to 50% within a decade. Section 2 targets defense procurement, and this is where the document becomes genuinely aggressive. Canada has historically purchased 70 to 75% of its military equipment from American defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, General Dynamics. The document proposes flipping that ratio, directing 70% of an expanded defense budget to domestic Canadian manufacturers. The budget itself is expanding to 5% of GDP by 2035, up from the NATO floor of 2%. That is $81.8 billion over 5 years. Sources at the Pentagon say they were not consulted. American contractors stand to lose between $40 and $60 billion in projected Canadian defense contracts over the next decade. The F-35 purchase, 88 jets worth $19 billion, is under formal review. Here is what nobody is talking about. Section 3 addresses critical minerals, and this is the hidden nuclear option. Canada holds the world's third largest reserves of lithium. It is the fifth largest producer of nickel. It controls massive deposits of cobalt, rare earth elements, and uranium. These are the minerals that power every iPhone, every Tesla battery, every F-35 engine, and every semiconductor fabrication plant in the United States. Carney's document proposes a new framework for critical mineral export licensing that would prioritize trade partners who have signed bilateral economic partnership agreements with Canada. The U.S., which lacks a comprehensive mineral supply agreement with Canada, would be treated as a standard trading partner, not a privileged one. The U.S. currently imports approximately $26 billion worth of critical minerals from Canada annually. If those supply chains are redirected toward India, Japan, South Korea, and the EU, American tech companies face component shortages within 18 months. The document explicitly references the China-Canada trade normalization from January 2026, where both sides lowered tariffs on key sectors as a model for future mineral partnerships. This is Carney telling Washington, if you will not be our partner, Beijing will. The implications for American semiconductor manufacturing alone could cascade into a national security crisis of the first order. This is where the situation escalates from trade dispute to geopolitical crisis. The White House response, or rather the absence of one, tells you everything. As of this hour, there has been no formal statement from the National Security Council, no press conference from Bessent, no Truth Social post from the president. Sources inside the West Wing describe a state of paralysis. The White House legal team is consumed by the Supreme Court tariff fallout. They are trying to reimpose tariffs under Section 301 and Section 232, which require lengthy investigations and procedural prerequisites. They are trying to prevent $160 billion in refunds. They do not have the bandwidth to fight a trade war with their closest ally, while their primary trade weapon has been confiscated by the judiciary. The timing of Carney's document coincides with his departure for India, Australia, and Japan, a 10-day diplomatic blitz that started yesterday. He is not waiting for a response from Washington. He is building the alternative architecture in real time. In India, he will meet with Prime Minister Modi to finalize a comprehensive economic partnership agreement aimed at doubling bilateral trade to $70 billion by 2030. In Australia, expanded critical mineral supply chains. In Japan, a deepened $36.4 billion annual trade relationship. Each meeting is designed to present the world with a fait accompli. By the time Trump's team formulates a response, Carney will have signed preliminary frameworks with 3 of the world's largest economies. Let us talk about the domestic political dimension, because this is where Trump faces an impossible choice. The House just voted to rebuke his Canada tariff policy. 12 Republicans crossed the aisle. Farmers in Wisconsin and Minnesota are watching canola and dairy export markets evaporate. Auto workers in Michigan and Ohio are seeing assembly lines slow because Canadian-made parts carry a 25% surcharge under remaining Section 232 tariffs. Energy producers in North Dakota are watching Canadian crude, which supplies a significant portion of U.S. refinery capacity, become more expensive and less reliable. These are Republican voters. These are the MAGA base. They are being squeezed by a trade war that the Supreme Court just declared illegal. Here is the psychological dimension that the mainstream analysis is missing. Mark Carney is not a politician. He is an economist. He is the man who ran the Bank of England through Brexit. He is the man the Financial Stability Board chose to architect the global response to the 2008 crisis. Sources who have spoken with Carney describe a man who views Trump's trade policy as an irrational actor problem, a term from game theory describing a participant whose moves cannot be predicted through traditional means. Carney's solution is not to negotiate with the irrational actor. It is to build an entirely parallel economic system that renders the irrational actor's leverage irrelevant. This document is not a negotiating position. It is an exit strategy. The fact that Trump reportedly called Carney a world-class leader just months ago at their October White House meeting makes the betrayal sting. This is personal for the president. He views Carney's pivot as ingratitude. Sources say he is fixated on the China trade deal from January as evidence that Canada has chosen Beijing over Washington. For a man who defines relationships through loyalty and dominance, Carney's declaration of economic independence is a humiliation ritual of the highest order. Expect rage, expect threats, but do not expect a coherent policy response. Now let us push the scenario to the extreme. If Carney's blueprint is implemented on schedule, here is what happens. By the end of 2026, Canadian LNG begins flowing to Europe through the new Newfoundland terminal, displacing American natural gas exports worth approximately $8 billion annually. By mid-2027, the first wave of redirected critical mineral supply chains reaches Asian and European buyers, reducing American access to Canadian lithium and nickel by an estimated 30%. By 2028, Canadian defense procurement shifts produce visible winners. European and Korean defense contractors begin servicing Canadian military contracts that American firms assumed were permanent. The cascading effect on American defense industry jobs, concentrated in states like Texas, Virginia, and Connecticut, begins to materialize. According to preliminary modeling by Oxford Economics, a full Canadian trade diversification could reduce American GDP growth by 0.2 to 0.4 percentage points annually over a 5-year period, equivalent to roughly $50 to $100 billion in lost economic output. Lockheed Martin's revenue projections take a hit. General Dynamics' Canadian subsidiary faces restructuring. The domino effect reaches into the American heartland, where supply chain workers and defense contractors never imagined that Canada, of all countries, would be the threat. There is a second worst-case scenario that is even more dangerous, and it involves the critical minerals choke point. China currently dominates global processing of rare earth elements, controlling roughly 60% of mining and 90% of refining capacity. The United States has been trying to build an alternative supply chain, and Canada was supposed to be the cornerstone. But Carney's document positions Canadian minerals as a strategic asset to be leveraged for diplomatic benefit. If Canada routes its lithium and cobalt through partnerships that exclude the United States, the American semiconductor industry, the EV industry, and the defense industrial base face a dual dependency crisis, reliant on both China and Canada, with neither relationship secure. The irony is devastating. Trump's tariff policy was designed to make America less dependent on foreign supply chains. Instead, it has driven America's most reliable supplier into the arms of competitors. What does Xi Jinping see? He sees an American president who lost his primary trade weapon in the Supreme Court, whose closest ally is publicly divorcing from the economic relationship, and whose own Congress voted against his signature economic policy. What does Putin see? He sees a NATO ally redirecting defense spending away from American weapons systems. He sees opportunity. What does Modi see? He sees an 11-page invitation to become one of Canada's primary economic partners. Every world leader is reading this document today. Every one of them is recalculating. And here is what the average American voter needs to understand about what this means for their wallet. Canada supplies 4.3 million barrels of crude oil per day to U.S. refineries. Canada supplies 60% of the electricity consumed in northern states like Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine through hydroelectric exports from Quebec and Labrador. Canada is the single largest supplier of steel to the American construction industry, of softwood lumber to the American housing market, of auto parts to the American automotive sector. Every one of these supply chains is now subject to the Carney doctrine of strategic diversification. When Canadian oil starts flowing to Asian refineries through the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion, American gas prices go up. When Canadian lumber gets redirected to European and Pacific markets, American housing costs go up. This is not abstract economics. This is the price of groceries, the price of a new car, the price of heating your home. Let us also examine the political calculus inside Ottawa because Carney is not operating without risk. His $78 billion deficit for 2025-2026 is the largest in modern Canadian history. His Conservatives, led by Pierre Poilievre, are watching for any sign of overreach. But Carney has something that most politicians lack: credibility with international bond markets. His fiscal framework, which distinguishes operational spending from capital expenditure for the first time, has been received positively by credit rating agencies. The productivity super-deduction in the November budget is designed to make Canada's investment environment more competitive than America's, and the narrow 170 to 168 budget vote in Parliament showed that even his domestic opponents recognize the necessity of responding to Trump's economic aggression. Carney is governing with the slimmest of margins, but governing with conviction. Sources close to the Canadian delegation say Carney's message to foreign leaders is simple and devastating. The United States is an unreliable partner. He points to the IEEPA tariffs being struck down as proof that Trump's economic promises cannot survive judicial scrutiny. He points to the 150-day Section 122 time limit as proof that even the replacement tariffs are temporary. He points to the congressional vote as proof that even Trump's own party is fracturing on trade. And he offers an alternative: Canada, with its stable governance, its resource wealth, its AAA credit rating, and its network of free trade agreements spanning 51 countries through the CPTPP and the EU partnership. The pitch is working. The UAE committed $70 billion in investment during Carney's November visit. Ecuador and Indonesia have signed new trade agreements. India is actively negotiating a comprehensive economic partnership. Let us get technical about the financial plumbing because this is the mechanism that reshapes the international monetary system. Canada's total trade with the United States exceeds $700 billion annually. That trade generates enormous demand for U.S. dollars, supports American financial markets, and anchors bilateral current account stability. If Canada redirects even 20% of its U.S. trade volume, roughly $140 billion, to non-U.S. partners, the demand for U.S. dollars in Canadian trade settlement drops proportionally. Canadian firms begin holding larger reserves of euros, yen, rupees, and potentially renminbi. The Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, with over $600 billion in assets, has been quietly increasing its non-U.S. allocations. The financial plumbing of the continent is being rerouted. History teaches us that economic divorces between allied nations produce unpredictable consequences. When Britain abandoned the gold standard in 1931, it shattered global financial architecture and accelerated the Depression. When the United States imposed the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in 1930, it collapsed world trade by 65% within 3 years. When France withdrew from NATO's military command in 1966, it weakened the alliance for a generation. We are not yet at those thresholds, but the trajectory is alarming. What Carney is proposing is not a tariff dispute. It is a structural decoupling of the two most integrated economies in the Western Hemisphere. This is what the Globe and Mail has termed the Carney paradox. More integration brings economic benefits but threatens national sovereignty, while protecting sovereignty by reducing integration carries enormous economic costs. There is no good option. There is only the least bad one. And Carney has decided that sovereignty is worth the price. This is exactly what the framers of the post-war international order sought to prevent. Economic integration was supposed to make conflict between allies unthinkable. Carney is arguing that in 2026, economic integration itself has become the weapon. This is the stress test of the North American alliance, and Washington is failing it. This is not just about trade numbers or GDP projections. Can the United States afford to lose Canada as its primary trade partner? Can the American economy absorb the supply chain disruptions? Can the political system survive the backlash from workers and businesses caught in the crossfire? The answer, based on everything sources inside Washington are telling us, is no, not today, not this week, possibly not before the 150-day Section 122 clock expires in July. The White House is fighting on too many fronts. The president's attention is fractured. The legal team is overwhelmed. The economic team has no playbook for a scenario in which America's closest ally formally declares economic independence. We are in uncharted waters. The compass is spinning. So as we head into the weekend, watch the feeds. Watch for the preliminary trade framework announcements from New Delhi. Watch for the Australian Mineral Cooperation Memorandum. Watch for the Japanese Energy Partnership deal. Watch for the White House to scramble for a response that sounds tough, but offers no mechanism to actually stop what is happening. Watch for Truth Social. Watch for the market reaction on Monday morning when traders price in the implications of a fragmenting North American trade bloc. But most importantly, watch for Congress, because the real question is whether the 12 Republicans who voted against Trump's tariff policy will become 20, and then 30, and then enough to override a veto. The trade war was supposed to make America stronger. Instead, it has driven the country's most reliable partner to the exits. The 11-page document sitting on every foreign ministry desk in the world this morning is not a threat. It is a farewell letter. And the White House has no answer. Canada's debt-to-GDP ratio sits at 42.4%. America's exceeds 120%. Canada maintains a A credit rating. International markets are pricing Canadian sovereign debt as safer than American sovereign debt. Carney is not spending recklessly. He is making a leveraged bet on Canadian sovereignty using the cheapest financing available in the G7. This is what a central banker does when he becomes a prime minister. He does not think in election cycles, he thinks in interest rate curves. The Teflon alliance between Ottawa and Washington is not just cracking, it is melting. The bonding agency of shared economic interests that held these two nations together for 7 decades has defaulted. The stay has been lifted, the shield is down, and there is no Supreme Court ruling, no executive order, no Truth Social post that can put it back together. Subscribe, stay tuned. The economic architecture of the Western world is being rewritten this weekend, and the history books will record who was paying attention and who was asleep at the wheel.